probably best known for his work on British and South Asian migration and settlement, 18th century exploration of the Pacific Northwest, and, most importantly, the history of British Columbia. So I'm very proud to introduce Dr. Johnston.
Thank you very much. And I did give you received a piece of paper from. So that is your assurance that I come here with a plan. And I think Catherine's idea was that this should operate like a TED Talk, or I don't know whether it will. But there should be a lot of time for questions. Now, I have planned enough material to more than take up the time. So I think the best compromise is if you want to interrupt, ask a question, make an observation, feel free to do it, because that's the original concept. And none of us will worry if I don't get to the end of this outline. So you'll get something before we get to the end. But if you feel that this, just feel free to interrupt me, and then I'll stumble on from that point. So the past, I was given the word stories, which I had used in one of the courses I taught, but that left me liberty to go in many directions. So I cast about in my mind for some are more classically described as stories, some are not. I taught in the seniors program thanks to my colleague Alan Cunningham, who ran it for quite a number of years, and I proposed these stories, and he said, no, you can't do that, that's literature. I always thought history was about stories, but in fact, I had to wait quite a number of years before I could actually give that course. But stories. And could we have an image? Oh, I want the image before. That's the one, and then you can back it up to that, yeah, yes. So, and that I took only a few blocks from my house. And we know these as the lions. And I was talking to somebody in the 70s, but he was one of the spiritually inclined hippies. And he explained to me how we hold our environment in place with our imagination. If our imagination wobbles, our environment wobbles. But what's holding it all together in Vancouver is the collective imaginations of all the people here. So I offer you, we look at this all the time, and that we know them as the lions. I don't know why. I've never been able to, well, I now know. But I can't see lion. Is it 2 years? What is it? In fact, the name dates from, I think, 1880. And a British naval person saw two heraldic lions in the position of lions couchant. So they're lying down, their bodies are stretched out to the left and the right, and their heads are up. And so everyone will know in Vancouver what you're talking about. The name migrates around, it gets to the football team and so on, the Lions. Now we can have the image before. These are the lions. You can see the shape of the two peaks at the top. But these are not the lions. This is what the lions would have been known here by the people living here for who knows how many years, thousands. The two sisters. These are the two sisters. That excuses my title, Remembered and Forgotten, because most of us don't remember the two sisters. And the story told on the Squamish Reserve goes right back to the beginning of time and the creation of these two mountains. Their father was a great chief, and the people here were at constant war with the people in Haida Gwaii. And the sisters said, have a big potlatch and invite them. And it worked. They had peace. And as their I wouldn't want this as my reward, but as their reward, they were turned into these 2 mountain peaks. So there are two notions of those 2 peaks, and there's one that we hear about, and one that some of us hear about. This now, a cultural appropriation we mentioned. This image, which I'm assured by my wife, who's an artist, is a beautiful image by a North Vancouver graphic artist who just recently died. His name was Ken Lin. And he did it for a 1950s edition of Pauline Johnson's Legends of Vancouver. And that's where I got that story. But he, as you judge by the name, was Chinese. He was a Chinese immigrant. He had immigrated about 8 years before. And then he did this beautiful image. So we've got sort of layers of imagination right here in that image. So that's my excuse for the title, Remembered and Forgotten. Now I'll move. Here we are. So I knew I was going to do this lecture, and I was thinking about continuity in our past, that things in a way go on with connection to what went before, but great discontinuity too. And the other word going with that is diversity. So homogeneity and diversity. So since I have an office that I use occasionally near the corner of Seymour and Hastings, I said I'll go to the corner and I'll take the first group of people coming across with the first change of lights. And that's the honest truth. And this is what I got. I have no idea what their histories are. You know, it is quite possible that they all grew up in Vancouver and have multi-generations here, but that looks like a diverse group. Actually, we could take the next picture, which spreads it out a bit. So there they are on the right. And that's Vancouver to me. Now, let's go back to SFU 50 years ago. Keep advancing. This picture you may be well aware of. And this is in the period of student protest. The year is 1968. This is Freedom Square. And the president of the university is addressing students, and they've turned out en masse. Now you look at them. Where do they come from? I keep seeing white faces. Maybe you can pick out somebody else, but there's another picture with the same occasion, at a different angle. You can't make them out maybe from your distance that well, but is that a contrast with my standing on the corner of Hastings and Seymour? It seems to me. The other thing is start counting the men. Try to find the women there. They are, but they are there as a much smaller percentage than we're used to today. All right, let's move on. This is Lord Stanley, who was briefly the Governor-General of Canada. I went to Stanley Park, took this picture, looked at that inscription, which I can't read now, but it welcomes everybody of every race and creed. Date is 1889. So this is an ideal that people expressed, that a Governor-General would come all the way from Ottawa and express this as an ideal. We welcome everybody. Well, he's welcoming them to the park, but underlying that is a notion that we welcome everybody. Let's try another image. Now this is a question of diversity, and we're on the Fraser River, and we're prospecting for gold, and the people there are all local people who have lived there for thousands of years. So we think of the gold rush and people coming up from California, but the first people to find that gold that started off were local people. And these are interior Salish. And this is about 1860. Let's try another one. The idea is diversity on the same river. This is a watercolor, I think by somebody here may know the watercolor. I've forgotten the name of the artist. It strikes me as a very good watercolor, but these are Chinese working on the Fraser River for gold. So there are the First Nations there are these Chinese. Let's try another one. Langley at the same time. So there's no European city in Vancouver. There's no European city in the province. The main European center is here. Well, it's not simply European, as you can see. It's an international center. And then we have a variety of groups. In the book where I got this, the caption explains. Yes, there are a group of Royal Engineers brought into the province to work on the Caribou Road. The group down in the lower right corner are Stolo, the local people. Then you have the Chinese merchants. And you go around, it's a very diverse group there in Langley. That's how the, what do we call it, the immigrant or settler community, it's a frontier community in British Columbia started. That's what it looked like. Try again. This is the same time. This is in Victoria. This is a black rifle corps raised in Victoria when there were very, very few settlers there, but these people had come up with others from California at the time of the rush, gold rush, and they wanted to form a fire brigade, which they were not allowed to do. So then they were said, well, you create a militia unit, and they did that. Took quite a few years before they got any rifles, but there they are, and they're part of that early settlement community. Another image. Now I jump up to 1901, but again, it's a question of diversity, and where Grand Forks were in the southern interior of the province. Doukhobor women pulling a plow. In place of oxen. Let's try another one. This is my home in North Vancouver, but where we are in the first decade of the 20th century, and now I can't identify these people and who they are and where they may come from, but I know from what I've read that this includes, these are people working on the local sawmill on the North Shore, and they're working on the docks. And these ships are in there to take lumber, and that lumber goes all around the world. In fact, it goes to Australia, it goes to Asia, it goes to Europe, it goes to the east coast of North America. They will include Hawaiians, Kanakas. They include Asians, and there are Europeans there. It's a mix of people, and this again is early in the municipality that I live in at the moment. Okay, let's try something else. The first mayor of Vancouver. I knew that was there. I suppose I've looked at it before, but because I was going to be talking today, I went out with my camera and took the picture. And this is David Oppenheimer. And he came with 4 other brothers from Europe, they were from Bavaria. They came out to, I think, Louisiana and then California. And from California, they came out to Victoria and then Vancouver. Now, they are merchants and they're developers, let's say. This David Oppenheimer, before the CPR railway was built from Port Moody into Vancouver, had purchased tracts of land along the way. And he was a big pusher for the first positive urban things that happened here. So electrification, electric railways, sewage, and all the rest. And he was there for 4 critical years. Oppenheimer, some of you will know, was Jewish. He was part of the mix. Now this, at that time, was not an unusual thing that we had in the elites of Eastern Canada, Eastern United States, and so on, well integrated, were Jews, both those from Portugal that had come long ago and were thoroughly anglicized, and those from England and Germany. And he was one of the Germans. But he was thoroughly integrated into the business elite of Vancouver at the beginning. To some extent, he was running it. What's the irony? I didn't know this until I had a student who was a mature student and president of the Jewish Historical Society, and he wrote an essay for me. And in the essay, he explained that the Vancouver club, the businessmen's club, never belonged to one. Somebody here has? My impression is that you need them so that when things get too noisy at home, you have somewhere to go and have a nap. But that businessmen's club, the Vancouver club, was founded a year after Vancouver got its charter and when he was in his first term of mayor. And he was a founding member with his brother Isaac. At some point, that club stopped taking Jewish members. And this is what I learned from Cyril Leonov. And it didn't take Jewish members. Well, somebody give me a guess. How recently? I just looked this up. I couldn't have told you yesterday. How recently do you think that they weren't allowing Jewish members? Well, up to 1977. So, so we're talking about continuity, integration, homogeneity, diversity, and so on. So I had to run down to Stanley Park and take this man's portrait. Could we have another one? All right, this is the turning point. This is when I move into what I've identified as a second phase of the talk. And you will know that picture. It's from 1907. It's from the anti-Asian riots here in Vancouver. This is looks to me like the photograph is taken the next morning. Actually, I have an interest and affection for the Sikh community, and there is a Sikh standing just if it had been a larger frame, he's there. He's supposed to be in the picture, but he's not. From that point on, Canada, by and large, did not take Asian immigrants. So let's have a picture here. This is the story I know too well, the story of the Komagata Maru. This is 1914. This is a South Asian ship that came and tried to breach the barrier there was for Asian immigrants and didn't succeed, and there it's on its way back across the Pacific home. So that is a regime that lasted for half a century. So that's why I take a picture of Simon Fraser University and I see all those white faces. But now I can stand on the corner of Hastings and Seymour and take another picture. this is something you're familiar with. This is the Slocan Valley, and these is the Japanese who were moved from their homes and away from their businesses and so on, and temporarily there they were camped in tents and put in homes, but that's during the Second World War, and it illustrates again this gap that I was speaking of. Let's have another one. Oh, now, this picture comes from the, I've got it on your outline. And I've forgotten the name of the sound, but the sound is in the northern part of Vancouver Island. And, Thank you, yes.
I was wondering if we could have the lights off.
Sure.
So the picture's better.
If somebody could,
I can do that.
thank you.
Good
Yes,
idea.
so it is something of a triumph to be able to project this because it comes from a book and it was a grainy image to begin with. But how's that? What? Ah, thank you. Thanks very much.
But how is the filming? Okay, good.
So one thing to look at, this is a picture of women and children. And it's in the 1880s. But there actually aren't very many children there. And that's significant. And at that time, the mortality rate amongst children of First Nations people in this province was terrible. And the population was taking a nosedive as a consequence. So let's have the next one. This is, you can't read that very well because the lettering is small. I tried to help you with a little red ink. But the low point is 1929. And this is the province, this is the population of indigenous people in British Columbia. So it was much higher. It became much higher, and today it will be about 3 times the top on the right. The turning point came then, and what was happening, it was smallpox. It was influenza, and smallpox, tuberculosis. And it's really when the smallpox they began to get a handle on in the latter part of the 19th century. The tuberculosis, they really seemed to turn the corner on there in the 1920s. And this is globally. So if you read stories of aristocratic British families, it's surprising how often that people are dying early from tuberculosis. But it was really bad here, and it was especially bad in First Nations coastal communities. That's the far side of Vancouver Island. It was very bad, and then it turns. But now one can visualize this period of a half century or more in which the people who were doing well, the people who were coming in numbers, and the people who were dominated were from Europe. And I've given you several reasons. They're not reasons, but examples. Now, I want to turn to the Squamish Reserve, and which is right there. One of the pieces of it is right where the sea bus lands. So I'm looking at it all the time as I go back and forth from SFU downtown to the North Shore. But here we're back in the 1840s, and the Catholic missionaries had just arrived. This picture is at Mission, and there are several Catholic missionaries leading prayer amongst the local people there. That's the Oblate Order. It's a comparatively new order dating from the beginning of, I mean, at this point it was not even half a century old. Came from Provence, but it became very important amongst First Nations people in British Columbia through the fur trade, because so many of the people and Europeans employed there were from Quebec and were French Canadian. So that order followed them, and then, of course, had an impact, and in a surprisingly short time. So 1830, they weren't there. But let's have the next. This is the Catholic Church that you can see as you arrive at the North Shore Lonsdale Quay. And it's still there. But it was built, I think that picture's from 1884. So the Oblates hadn't been here very long, and there was this community is a Catholic community. And these are all belong to the Squamish Nation, these houses, these frame houses, in the vicinity of the church. Another picture. So I took that when I should have been getting home. I took that picture, and again, it's close to the sea bus. It's actually on Squamish land, and I walked through a gate, and I wasn't sure whether I should, if there were people working there, and I said, I want to take a picture, and they, come on. And so I took this. Now I'm taking, so that's one of their boats they're working on, and so on. There's a railway track between this part of the reserve and the church. By the way, I showed you an 1880 picture of the church, and it had one steeple. Nobody said anything when I put up two steeples, but yes, they built another steeple about 1913. And I didn't know that a week ago, but I've been looking at it, wondering about these two pictures. So let's have the next one. Here we are. So you can see the two-steepled church and the railway track. So to the left in the picture, we have the waterfront and a big marina now and so on. But that railway went through and cut off the village from the water. It would have been negotiated, the government and the railway company and the Squamish Nation, but the Squamish Nation didn't have a lot of power in the negotiation. So there's a bit of history just in a bit of railway track. Next one. And this is Chief Capilano. There is quite a fascinating book called Chief Capilano, produced by the first Vancouver city archivist, Major Matthews. And it has reproduced the typescript of Matthews' interviews with Joe Capilano, whom and this was 1939 he was doing that. He says Capilano couldn't read or write, but he was bringing, for Matthews' benefit, up all the stories that he remembered of his people. And one day in the archives, he sat down in an alcove and he did a couple of drawings. And Matthews makes a note, he'd never done any before. Let's see if that's what comes up. Here we are. So now, first contact, as remembered and told by a Squamish chief. This is 1792. This is when the British and the Spanish first brought their tall ships into the Burrard Inlet. They first came off this, well, just about, not quite. Vancouver was mapping this whole coast from the Columbia River right up to Alaska, and he came in. Spanish were just doing something similar at the same time, and so this is Joe. The signature at the bottom would have been written by Major Matthews, but that is Capilano's own picture. There's another one. There we are. So then he told stories about first contact, and these tall ships appeared, and they thought from a distance at first they were floating islands with trees. Or maybe they didn't think that, I don't know. This is how the story comes down. So whether, okay. And then they went out there, and then they exchanged things, and they were given molasses, and they were given ship's biscuit, and they had no idea, according to Capilano, what to do with it. So they tried to use the molasses to repair their canoes, sticky stuff. And they had a game that involved rolling discs on the ground, and they tried to use the ship's biscuit for that. And they did marvel at these sailors who blew out smoke. So there we are, reaching back a couple of centuries now. One, I showed you that image by a Chinese artist. He's Chinese-Canadian. He immigrated as a young man. He immigrated at the end of that long period in which Asians couldn't come. And then he went to the Vancouver School of Art. And then he became a very accomplished artist, whole life on the North Shore. I showed you that. And that is an illustration for a later edition of Pauline Johnson's book, The Legends of Vancouver. And of course, I've known all the time I've been in Vancouver that Pauline Johnson has a memorial spot in Stanley Park. And I guess early on I went and looked at it, but I hadn't been back. Not that I remembered. And, but it's near the tea house, and it's near English Bay, and there it is. And it's the only such memorial in the park that I find out by going online, you know. Let's see what she looks like. This is Pauline Johnson performing, and in her native dress. She's interesting to me because she actually was from Brantford, Ontario. She's a Mohawk. She's one of the native people from eastern part of the country. And the Mohawk were really quite famous, and she has the name Smoke. So Pauline Smoke. She has another Indian name too, Johnson. Smoke is a translation of the Iroquois name, which is multi-syllables and quite lovely to sound and a wonderful image. The Iroquois word meant early morning haze as it rises from the forest floor and disappears with the midday sun. So some of the English people around made it simpler and said, smoke. And so we have the smokes that come from the Brantford area, and Pauline was one of them. But she did come out to Vancouver, and then she went to the Squamish people, and she talked to a chief there, and he told her what he remembered, what he knew, I shouldn't say, of the Squamish stories. That became her book. So she is a person of First Nations origin from another part of the country, who then is a translator of local stories. She is also half English because, and her family were chiefs in the Mohawk tradition. But she was very popular. She could draw large crowds, and she could draw them all over Canada and in Britain. She recited her poetry, and she recited other things. She is probably presented to royalty several times. But then she made this connection here, and she had the First Nations background. Let's see what comes up next. Oh, that's her grandfather. That's her Iroquois grandfather. And that picture would have been taken in Brantford, Ontario. And that now you can think of her sitting down with the Squamish chief, and he accepts her as someone with sensitivity. She'd done the same with her grandfather. So we'll go next.
Hugh,
Yes.
just before you go to the next image here, your theme about names and labels, which you started out with,
Right.
has a little echo in the
Good.
Pauline Johnson story, in that schools all across Canada
Oh,
are named after,
certain.
including one in West Vancouver.
Yes, that's right. I should have mentioned that one. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. So that, I think I'm fair to say that her name has a resonance, and perhaps just through the schools now, but when we were growing up, I think we were aware of her, weren't we? Even though not.
I come from near Brantford, so we were all aware of it.
Right, yes, yeah. We'll go. Okay. Now I come to the first governor. Actually, maybe it's almost the last governor, but British Columbia, as a European community, had its first civil government under this man, James Douglas. And this is his wife, Amelia. And on my theme of homogeneity and diversity and our beginnings and how things change and how they change again, I have to mention them. I had a friend who was a West Indian, and he was definitely of, a considerable part of his ancestry was black. And he had worked for the World Bank in Switzerland, and then he retired and came here. And then a few years later he said, "What do you know about James Douglas?" Well, I had never thought about James Douglas. But my friend was interested because that's his own story to some extent. James Douglas had black ancestry. His mother was, and he grew up in Guyana, and you can properly speak of him as from the Caribbean. If you think of Guyana and how close it is to the Caribbean islands, and his family had lived in the Caribbean, his black side. So his mother was a free black, slave ancestry. His father was a Scottish merchant. Came out to Guyana, did business, acquired a companion in this free black woman who, I understand, come to understand, belonged to the elite of the society there. And she had her own business, and she had, she was a person of some substance. But he made a household with her, and then he went back to Scotland, left her there. Whose choice that was, I don't know. It's a familiar story when you think of so many different groups who have gone far afield, found companions, and then returned home. So, and this, it's not just Europeans who do it. It's follow that pattern. So he came back, took up with her again, had 2 sons. And when those sons were about 9 or 10, and he returned to Scotland, he doesn't take his companion with him. He takes 2 boys. And they had 4 or 5 years of schooling in Lanark in Scotland. And then what do you do with these boys? They're old enough to be apprenticed. How are they going to, I don't know, because that's not recorded anymore, I'm just speculating, but how well will they make out in Scottish society? And he apprenticed them to the big, one of the big fur trade companies operating in North America, the Northwest Company. So one of them did well, one did not. James was the one who did well. So he came and rose eventually to the top, starting off as a 14-year-old doing whatever. And I counted it up because there was a map which showed all the places where he had been posted, from starting at Tadoussac, which is in Quebec, off the St. Lawrence River. 23 posts right across Canada. In Quebec, Northern Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, all the way out to British Columbia, and down in Oregon, and then ending up in Victoria. And by the time he was in Victoria, he was the chief factor. And then he was made, when civil government was introduced, he was made the governor. He carried 2 hats. The company was all the British had. It was a company running this vast territory from the Great Lakes out to the Pacific coast. Then they created a civil government, and the chief guy on the Pacific coast became the governor, and some people said he didn't do a good job, and remember who he was supposed to be working for, but and eventually he was stripped of the company job and became the governor. This is his wife, Amelia. And I think this makes a great start for British Columbia, because she was born at a Hudson's Bay Company post, or near it actually, on James Bay. If you can imagine Hudson's Bay and then the bay coming off it to the south, way off there. She was born there, and then her father, you might take to be Irish by his last name, but he was in reality French-Canadian. Her father was in the fur trade, and she moved with him, and she ended up in British Columbia, Stuart Lake. And their governor, Douglas, this is earlier in his career, his boss was actually Amelia's father, and he asked to marry the boss's daughter. So she's got several lineages, but Cree is one. And Irish, French, Canadian, right? And at Stuart Lake, when she was in her teens, and this is mid-teens, and he was in his early 20s, they married, bringing together many strands. Let's try another picture. Here she is with her 2 daughters. And now, there weren't very many Europeans living in Victoria at the time. And if you were a businessman, or if you were a senior company officer, and you looked around for available women with good family to marry, well, in many cases you ended up with Douglas's daughters. So let's go on. This is Helmcken. What's his first name? But he was the Hudson's Bay Company doctor sent out about 1848. You would have to sail all the way around South America and come up here. And he would be working under Douglas as the doctor. But he eventually married Douglas's daughter. His ancestry is interesting because he came from a German community in London, England. They were Hanoverians. They worked actually in a German-owned sugar refinery. So there was a fair community and a German Lutheran church and so on, and that was his whole community growing up. And then he got training as a medical doctor, and then he got a job with the Hudson's Bay Company, and he ended up on this coast. He is one of our fathers of Confederation. So this is a son-in-law of Governor Douglas, a husband of Amelia Douglas, Helmcken. His name is on the map of Vancouver. But when British Columbia was negotiating Confederation, he was one of 3 sent to do the negotiation. They were the ones who said, you have to build a railway. So you can associate that with him. What else have I got here? I'll finish in one more picture. This is Chief Capilano in his Squamish dress. And I understand that the features of this dress would be his personally, not for everyone to wear. But this, was and you look at his shoes, nice shoes. Let's take the next picture, and this is my last. Oh, no, jump. Oh, a couple of pictures dropped. Well, I can't do it then. I had taken a picture of the Squamish powwow a couple of years ago on the North Shore. And the striking thing, it's a wonderfully colorful occasion. The dance that they were performing there comes from the Plains Cree. As a matter of fact, the Plains dance has become universalized, and there were our First Nations people who come there every year, and they come from all over, but they perform the same dance. So the contrast, this is a kind of universalization of First Nations consciousness alongside this earlier very specific and local consciousness. These I wasn't going to show, but here they are. Go to the next one, please. No, that's it, all right. Well, that one gets... There is a new sculpture in Stanley Park, about 2 years old, and it is Portuguese Joe. It's a sculpture carved in cedar and then cast in bronze. It's quite magnificent. It's at Brockton Point. It was carved by his great-great-grandson. And he wasn't necessarily famous, except he's got a great name. There was a Portuguese Joe saloon downtown. There's a Portuguese Joe place in Comox where you can buy fish. But he came to North America in the middle of the 19th century as a whaler. He was Portuguese, but from Portuguese Azores. And so whaling ships leaving there and taking crew there and so on. And he went initially with his older brother and his father, and he was a whaler off this Pacific coast. And then left that and he settled on the Squamish Reserve, and he married in succession, because his first wife died, 2 local First Nations women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johnston. I know for one, am not going to walk around Stanley Park and look at it with like the same eyes. It's worth the trip, I must say. Thank you so much for this journey and fabulous use of photography and images to tell our past. I'm very honored to introduce our honors history student, Paul Choptrick, who is going to lead off a little bit of the discussion, and hopefully we will be pleasantly interrupted with the pizza people fairly soon, so we can have an informal discussion after. So, Paul, if you'd like to start off, and then we'll open it up to discussions to others.
Sorry about that. Still finding a little bit of a head cold. My first question for you is, in my copy of Legends of Vancouver, it gives a brief historiography of Pauline Johnson and how she started publishing stories. How she got $7, sort of 1907, every time she submitted one to the newspaper. So, I mean, given how widely read they would have been, and the ideas and stories that would have gone around, where do you think, how do you think it declined, this collective imagination, this interest in these stories? Because I certainly, before entering university, hadn't heard of her.
Although the name is there in West Vancouver, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was not familiar with the stories.
Yes.
But my grandparents' generation certainly would have.
Well, I think the last edition is in the 1950s, so that is telling us something. And she was very popular. I took Canadian literature at first year in university at Toronto, and we spent quite a bit of time on Canadian poets. She was not included. So the person who was making up the collection was dismissive of her poetry. There is a recent biography of her. Did you come across that? But she talks about it. The author, Charlotte Gray, talks about this. And Charlotte Gray thinks, yes, some of the poetry does descend into what you may call doggerel, but some is very fine. So this is a significant omission, especially because she had an audience. And she did make money with her writing, and for many years. And when she died, I think I referred to this, there was a move to put a memorial up in Stanley Park for her, and the park had a rule, no such things. But there was a sufficient campaign then, and we're talking about the 19-teens. There's a sufficient campaign then so that the Parks Board gave way. So it's a one and only. So for whatever reason, I mean, the exclusion of her from a major collection of poetry tells you something about maybe snobbishness about, I don't know. It happened. It's a good question.
Thank you. Any questions? Other questions from people in the audience?
Can I make a comment or a question?
Certainly.
I loved your use of landscape as a document, as a treatment here. And you might even extend that to the building. So the history you were describing could also be seen in the costuming, if you want to use that word.
It could be, yes. Yeah.
Anyway, as a document, of course, maybe you wouldn't be surprised at my reaction, but I love your use of the landscape that way.
Of course, we're looking at that mountain all the time, aren't we? But it was there, yeah.
That actually, I wasn't going to say anything about this, but there was a gender connection there that I just happened to think of. The use of female names for mountains,
Yes.
I think is probably quite widely spread. But I can't give you more than a couple of instances of my own incidental travels that I think of. But if you take the route from Prince Rupert to Prince George, somewhere along about a third of the way along, there is a view on the south side of the highway, and the mountains are in peaks. And it's called the Seven Sisters. You have
Yes.
the sisters here.
Yes.
So this is quite a different, a long way apart. But the idea of the mountains being represented in some kind of gendered manner, and a little more humorous, perhaps, if you understand the words. My own thesis area in Scotland is the mounds, rounded mountains, and there's one place where the two adjacent mountains are referred to as the two pats. Does everybody know the Scottish word pat? It refers to breasts. And so there again, there's
Yes.
understanding of the landscape, the look of the landscape.
Right.
So it just leave it at
I'm going to use my privilege as chair and come up with a question. Dr. Johnston, what attracted you to the study of the discipline of history?
Well, I have the wrong word, books. But no, that I kept heading for them. I like to tell people that I went to a one-room country school, and there was a big cabinet at the back full of books. And because there were only two of us in my grade level, we had a lot of free time. You get your work done, and the teacher is very happy if you go back to the cabinet and pull the books out. Well, the library there was an adult library. It was some member of the community who was a real reader and had given this cabinet and these books. And I read things that I couldn't understand at all, but I thought I did. And so, and history was a good part of it. So I can't stop reading it. And I know that it doesn't just come from books. So I do my best to correct that other side.
Thank you. I wonder if I could ask a supplementary. What would be your advice to the incoming government in the British province of British Columbia concerning their decision to do away with the requirement for grade 11 history of all students before they graduate?
Well, I may not give the expected answer. Did you see in the paper that in Ontario, the grade 11 literature course no longer includes Shakespeare?
That's right.
And in its place are First Nations authors. And you stop and think about that, and then it's hard to argue with it. And I was asked to, when I was a student at Ontario College of Education, I was given an essay, The History of History. So, and I still have that, you know, a few handwritten pages. But I learned then that history was not taught as a separate subject until late in the 19th century or the 20th century. And if it's going out now, you could say, well, it's had about 100-year life. There are many other disciplines in the same position. It wasn't taught as a discipline. You can't escape it, right? So people are reading history one way or another all the time, and maybe the best way to be doing it is not as a subject in school. But how can you study literature without history? Some of the best historians that I run into are people in sociology and geography and so on. It doesn't need to be a school subject. I think people will continue to chase after it.
I think you can see, oh, I've got another question, I'm glad, but I just wanted to say, I think we can see the origins of the claim to SFU as the radical campus right here, as the radical. Louis Johnson proposes a completely different approach to the disciplinary landscape. I love that. May I introduce Dr. Singh? Question.
It's a bit of a comment, Dr. Johnson. Is from reading your work, especially around the South Asian community and the Sikh community, is the way you tell stories, and you talk about, the color bar in a lot of your books, and the restrictions to immigration and the overt racism in the province, especially. But what your talk did today for me, and the way I love Jewels of the Killa, as you know, is it talks about these individuals and the complexity with their own identity and the interweaving of culture and identity and geography and location and just all of these different elements. And I think that's something that's so valuable that we can take away, because it complicates then how we understand, for instance, things like the color bar that existed in BC. So it's more of a comment to really just, it's a reminder of the value of these personalized stories and why we need to sometimes really focus on those.
Yes, please, in the back. Sorry. Oh, did you want to say?
No.
Yeah.
Well, I just say thank you, and thank you for the word complicate, because I always thought my job as a teacher was to confuse people.
Yes.
I'm reading Emily Carr, travels that she did in the 1920s, early 30s, and there are records about her in various canoes with Native people going to really remote places, and North Vancouver, and her people she knew on their reserve there. Are those considered reasonably accurate, or are they storied in some narrative that was special, like she created? Or does anyone ever comment on that? Because I've never really...
Well, Emily Carr is much written about, isn't she?
For art, more than her story.
Well, her story, her biography, I think you can fill up an arm with books about her. And so I would trust what she told me as much as anybody. And you can't trust anybody fully because... But people try to present things, and I was given an image just within the last week, but a Chinese notion of someone at the bottom of a deep well, and they look up and they think the sky they see up there is the whole sky. So that can be all of us.
Well, good note on which to conclude. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to encourage you to stay and have a little bit of lunch, pizza, and we'll be proceeding with the series. And our series next week is actually turning to recuperating Canadian Indigenous stories, so perhaps more along the line that we've been exploring today. Thank you all.